Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Bheki Mahlobo. Bheki, how's it going out there in the fine, sunny East?
I'm doing well, Nicholas. Thank you so much. Actually moved now. I'm no longer staying in the East Rand. I am now in the city of Johannesburg. But I'm doing
Welcome,
all right.
welcome. I'm very pleased to have
I'm,
you.
I'm doing all right. And how's the Terence?
Hi, Bheki.
And of course, we are also joined by Mr. Terence Corrigan, the venerable Terence Corrigan. Terence, how's it going?
I'm okay. I'm wondering if I'm going to get any more compliments on my haircut.
Let's hope so. All right. I actually trimmed my beard, but I don't think anyone noticed because it wasn't that much of a trim. But anyway, let's get into the news today. And our first story is one that I think sent a shiver down the spine of any South African who read it. And this is the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy is at least considering the idea of rationing fuel in South Africa. So we don't seem to have any definite plans yet. But in a briefing by the department to the Parliament yesterday, there was a discussion that South Africans may need to ration their fuel as a result of the ongoing war in Ukraine. The department said rising fuel prices were a global issue and developing countries would be hit hardest. They said that in the short term, there might be a R2 increase in the price of fuel. And this was definitely on the cards. And that if the war didn't end soon, that this may continue for a while. An official said, we may reach a point where we say that you fill up with 50 liters and that's per visit, but we're not there. I want to emphasize that we're not there. We don't think we'll get there. So they are obviously trying to play it cool, but they're at least putting the idea out into the public, which I think means we do have to take it fairly seriously. At the same time, the department is also considering temporarily suspending the fuel levy. So currently about, I think, 30% of the money we pay in petrol costs is in the fuel levy. And with the price of Brent crude oil going like upwards towards $140 per barrel, there's talk that we could give customers some relief by scrapping that levy, which I think is something we've kind of basically said should maybe be done. Of course, the problem with that is that the government gets about 6% of all of its taxes from the fuel levy. So even temporarily suspending it means that you're going to have this massive 6% sized hole in the fiscus, which is not great. And of course, I guess we'd say the solution to that is cut the budget, but the ANC is not very fond of that. So anyway, let me start with you, Terence. What do you make of this idea? What would be the effects of rationing fuel if we get there? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of scrapping the fuel levy, at least temporarily?
Well, I'm not quite sure that we will ever get to that scrapping the fuel levy either temporarily or permanently. I think that there would be a resounding chorus of rejoicing, but the problem, of course, comes in that people still want their benefits. They still want their services, as deficient as these frequently are. All that really means is that that fiscal hole will be passed on to future years, and I think that probably then brings income tax rises and things like that a lot closer. On rationing, that's an interesting one. I'm reminded of what was said of fuel rationing in America in World War II. The Americans didn't have rationing quite the way that the British or the Germans or whatever had it, but I said that people could deal with coffee shortages, sugar shortages, meat shortages, but there was no chicanery the American public would not indulge in to get hold of fuel. And given how dependent we are on energy, I think that this could well spark some very unpleasant criminality, hijacking fuel tankers, that sort of thing, selling off the side of the road, or fuel stations simply maybe breaking down purchases. You can only buy so many so many liters. So why don't we just stop filling up your car now and wait 2 minutes, and then we'll start filling it up again? I think that in a best case scenario, the enforcement would be, shall we say, uneven. The South African public is not known for its strenuous adherence to rules and regulations when it can get away from it. But irrespective of how this plays out, it shows the magnitude of the malaise that we are confronted with, doesn't it?
Exactly. I actually was filling up a car with petrol yesterday, and the petrol attendant sort of out of nowhere said, "It's tough to be a man these days. You've got to hustle so much to feed your family." And I looked at the petrol price and I said, "Yeah, man, that's kind of how it feels at the moment." Bheki, what do you make of all this? What do you think the effects of rationing would be? And do you agree with Terence that it probably won't be feasible because South Africans are not exactly the most law-abiding bunch of people in the world?
Nick, I can't think of a better way to make things more worse. This idea should never have even been considered. But this is actually quite reflective in the way of thinking of the ANC and the problems that comes with centrally planning. With fuel rationing, is that what you're trying to do is you're trying to determine the actions of millions of vehicles around the country. That means individual South African households. That means the transportation of goods. How would you know how much fuel each of those unit needs based on the different model types of the cars and so forth? That's an impossible task to do. And I completely agree with Terence that this will create a market in which there'll be selling of fuel, even at perhaps even a higher market, quote unquote, the black market and so forth. Not only that, but also the enforcement of this, I don't think will be quite even as what Terence has mentioned. The proper solution to this would be to cut on fuel levies, which is something I don't think the South African government would do. And there is a trade-off with that in the sense that it will impact the government revenues. But the way to also handle that is that you need to also cut down on your expenditure. You need to see that things are not, for example, improving for the South African consumer in an environment where you're seeing high fuel prices, high food prices, loss of income. As we currently speak, employment numbers have not recovered to their 2019 levels. So these South African consumers are severely strained from a budget perspective, from a purchasing power perspective. They cannot handle higher fuel prices. They cannot handle fuel rationing. It would be a major inconvenience for them, as well as it will actually cost more for them as well. So the right decision to do would be to actually cut on fuel levy.
Right, and rationing is an interesting solution. It's a solution that you come up with when you don't want to increase the price. But what does a price do? A price is a reflection of supply and demand, right? So, if the supply is down,
taxes in this case.
Right. If the supply is down, then you lower then the price goes up because it doesn't meet the demand. But because our price is controlled and not a market price, the government has to consider rationing as a means to get rid of it, or at least to prevent us running out of fuel. Because the only thing worse than rationing fuel is having no fuel, or alternatively, of people spending 40 rand a liter on petrol, which might happen anyway, as you guys have pointed out, through the black market.
Here's a thought just before we end here. I don't think fuel rationing is going to work, even if it is tried. But what we might find ourselves in is a sort of situation like the world was in the 1970s. Once again, unlike you guys, I'm old enough to remember it, sort of. Although I didn't remember, the specifically. But there were in the United States where auto sports and driving is a national passion. There were petrol stations that just didn't have fuel for days on end because they couldn't get it. I think that is a possibility.
Yes, no, I think that's very real. I see here Colin also has mentioned the cessation of fuel refining in SA. This is actually something we had a speaker speak to us at the IRR recently about, is how South Africa's refineries are in a very bad state at the moment. And there's been news stories circulating about how I believe our main refinery is basically shutting down at the moment, and that affects something like a third of our fuel supply. So the government is certainly blaming global events, and it's true. Everywhere around the world, fuel prices are going up now. But it's not as though we've covered ourselves in glory on our domestic front here. And of course, we also have undeveloped oil reserves, probably off our coast, which have been blocked both by government and also by people who live along those coasts, environmental groups, that kind of stuff. Bheki, any final thoughts just on the refining point, if you have any?
Yeah, also on the refining point, the main issue with the refining point is the fact that the petrol price is controlled, right? So a lot of South African refineries were not able to get through a higher price in order to get revenues to improve their infrastructure and so forth. So it's actually also quite reflective of the government-controlled price, the fuel price rather. So the consequence of that is that South Africa will have to actually import a lot more in terms of refining products and so forth. Which does also unfortunately carry a foreign currency risk and so forth, which may lead to the rand weakening and so forth. Yeah, so the only consequence, well, the main consequence to the closing down of refineries is largely due to the government-controlled fuel price.
Right. So let's move on to our next topic now, while we all think about how to factor in R2 petrol price increases into our budgets. And this also comes out of Parliament. Basic Education Minister Angie Motshekga was answering some questions in a parliamentary Q&A. And she was asked about government's plans for home language education. Angie Motshekga said that she believes that one of the major problems with education in South Africa is that a lot of students are not even taught in their home language. They are taught in English, which she described as basically a foreign language to a lot of these kids. And she said, quote, "They are no longer being tested on their cognitive development or understanding of the work. You are now testing their language abilities, which is a problem." So she said that government is now beginning to try and change this, and that they're rolling out programs to assess the language which is being taught in schools to see if they can introduce more mother tongue education. And that they had already run some pilot projects in the Free State and the Eastern Cape, where they had tested some schools there and said that they had been successful pilot projects. However, the minister did also say that it would be impossible to transition to a purely mother tongue-based system. And according to her, that in cases where it's a little bit difficult to translate stuff, for example, words that are complicated scientific or mathematical concepts that don't necessarily have a mother tongue equivalent, that technology and other systems will be used to translate these words. So Bheki, good idea, bad idea? What do you make of the minister's suggestion of mother tongue education?
So on this topic, I think there is a case for introducing or allowing parents to choose whether they would like their child to be taught in their mother tongue. But English is definitely the most important language. I can recall like so many books are in English and have not been translated to the respective mother tongue languages. South Africa has 11 official languages. So if you want to teach South African pupils in their mother tongues, you would need to translate each and every book in 11 official languages. You would need to get staff members that will be proficient in teaching those languages, those 11 official languages. And I don't think that the Department of Education will be successful in that endeavor. So I do believe that there is a case to introduce or to allow the parents to choose for the student to learn in their mother tongue. However, I'd really look at this from the Department of Education perspective as an excuse for their failures. The cause of dropout levels, the cause of decline in education standards in South African schools is not because the students are not taught in their mother tongue. It's because of the declining in education standard in the country, teacher absenteeism, the decline in infrastructure in these schools. For example, I went, in my grade 12 winter school. I went to a school in the Eastern Cape where there's no proper roof, for example. There's an open roof. The teachers are absent. The students are not attending classes and so forth. So those are the issues that the Department of Education really needs to address. It must not blame this on the fact that these students are not being taught in English. I can guarantee, well, not guarantee, but a large proportion of South African students do know English, they are able to learn English, they are able to comprehend in English. It is just that the education standard of South Africa is not up to par. That's the real issue.
Right, and you mentioned our 11 official languages here, and this for me is, on a practical standpoint, one of the problems I think with this. So I think about, in the Eastern Cape, for the most part, it's probably going to be pretty easy. Most schools can teach in Xhosa. That's fine, right? KZN, similar. Most schools are teaching isiZulu. But then you get to Joburg, let's say a Soweto school. What language are you going to teach in that school? Is it Zulu? Maybe the majority of the students will speak Zulu, but probably at least half won't. And I can see an enormous amount of drama and contestation between students there who end up, Sotho-speaking students who end up having to learn in Zulu, which doesn't really solve the problem. It just transfers it. And of course, my other fear is that, considering that we have generally such poor standards of education, that English just won't be taught at all then, really. I mean, kids will probably have to take it in school, but that doesn't mean they'll actually learn it. And your job prospects and opportunity to work in all sorts of industries, such as tourism, which are great for people who don't have a university education, are kind of limited if you don't have at least some English skill. So anyway, Terence, what do you make of this proposal? Workable, necessary? What are your thoughts?
Look, on the reasoning behind it, I'm going to say something that's probably never been said on the Daily Friend show before. I agree with the government minister. I can imagine, and I've actually had experience of language teaching, learning other languages as an adult, and enrollment in a school where the mother tongue is not the language of the child. And I think that she's absolutely correct. I think cognitively, your school experience builds on your home experience, your community experience. That's not to say that someone is inherently at a disadvantage. If that person does not speak the school language at home, but I think that there is a world of difference between, let's say a child who's an immigrant from China goes to an English school in Johannesburg and is surrounded by native or near-native speakers all the time, and people whose families do not speak it, using it kind of as a lingua franca. It's tough. The practicalities of this, though, are I just don't think are workable. Certainly not in Gauteng, probably not in any of the major cities. But then again, you could argue that the sort of aggregate proficiency in English amongst children coming from Zulu or Sotho-speaking households in Gauteng in English is probably somewhat higher than it would be, say, in rural KwaZulu-Natal. Two problems you're immediately confronted with. Do you have the teaching core that can take that up? Because it's often, you often assume, well, this person is a native speaker, therefore they're able to conduct conduct business in that language. That's not always the case. I imagine that there are many people who speak one language at home, but would find it very difficult to work in that language. If you're a multilingual person, you'll often structure your sort of language experience accordingly. The other thing is what happens after school. Bheki makes a point about English proficiency, and I suppose, and this is a horrible way to sort of look at it, but the choice is that for non-English speakers or people who do not live, let's say, in an environment which will generate that, English language instruction maybe prepares a certain proportion of them to go on to higher education or to enter the job market with a high level of proficiency in English, while leaving a lot of other kids behind. Or do you go to the end of your school career proficient in your home language and probably having a more well-rounded education experience, but then you lack the sort of specific golden key to the economy, which is English. What I do think, interesting point here, AfriForum must be cackling.
Yes.
Look, once again, this is Terence is old enough to remember when we got our 11 official languages. I think it was Lorimer who said that was a decision taken in bad faith, because what it did was it technically preserved the status of Afrikaans, but it said, well, for practical reasons, though, we have to essentially become unilingual. So what we've really seen since the mid 1990s is the downgrading of South Africa as an officially multilingual society, even though in de jure we are. We should be much more multilingual. There's even been talk amongst linguists that certain languages now that are recognized as official in South Africa will no longer exist in 2 or 3 generations. Sad, but
I struggle to imagine how outside of some very specific parts of Limpopo, how languages like Tsonga and Tsivenda are going to be, the pool for teachers there is just not going to be great. And as you say, it's languages like that are probably in a lot of trouble. Also, of course, Southern Ndebele is another language where I don't think I've ever met someone who speaks Southern Ndebele as their home language.
Yeah,
it's really rare.
Well, look, someone put in the comments about importing Cuban teachers. Interesting thing. Your haircut hides your age well. Look, my age is not something I care to discuss. Except when it's useful, then I will. There's a Cuban community in Florida, and 2 or 3, 2 generations on, a lot of these people speak Spanish pretty much in their own little bubble. It's been remarked, and this is quite an instance of cultural survival, that many of them, many of their descendants have not anglicized, and that someone's pointed to as an example of, well, you don't really need you don't really need to fit into the broader society. But the thing you have to acknowledge there is, okay, sure, but then their lives are sort of confined to that part of the world, and if that's great, that's great. But if you look at a country like Denmark, Danish is the national language, but pretty much everyone there will be fluent in English as well. And then often in other languages, the Dutch, you can have a very, very fulfilling life, never leaving the borders of the Netherlands. But they say the difference between the Americans and the Dutch is that all the Dutch speak English well. So.
Yeah, Bheki, I think so. Terence made that point slightly earlier about how, when you're trained to work or teach or something in a certain language, it's not necessary. You can't necessarily just replicate it in your home language. Yeah. And I think you and I even had a conversation about you had this issue at one stage. I may be putting words in your mouth, but I seem to remember you said that because your home language is Xhosa, but you said that it was sometimes difficult to do kind of analysis stuff in Xhosa because you're used to doing it in English. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. So my whole schooling career since I was young, primary, creche, high school, university, has been done in English. And then when I go home, I speak Xhosa with my mother and my family members and so forth. And when I do the work that I do for the Institute, it's done in English, looking at such as the polling data as well as socioeconomic data indicators and so forth. That's done from reading English reports and have to report it in English and so forth. And so when I go on Xhosa radio stations like Mahlobo and Nene, I'll find it quite difficult to state that data in my home language. It's quite difficult as well. And in certain words as well that are not in Xhosa. So therefore I use that English term to say it, for example, and so forth. So it is definitely going to be a problem for those students as well, where throughout their school career, they've been taught in English, and then all of a sudden they need to switch to their home language. I think a better way to do it is rather through the introduction from primary and so forth. But English, as what Terence has mentioned, as well as what you've mentioned, is also quite important when it comes to employment. It's used as a means to communicate, especially in urban areas like Johannesburg, for example, where there's multi-languages in South Africa as well as from abroad when looking at people that come for employment and so forth. So yeah, that will definitely be a challenge for the Department of Education.
All right. Let us go on to our final topic for today, and we're going to stick with education here. And this is a story that we got from ENCA. A former Eastern Cape principal was found guilty a while ago of ordering a student into a pit toilet as punishment. An 11-year-old pupil was forced by this principal to get into a pit toilet. The principal who is accused of this was arrested and pleaded guilty to a charge of child abuse, and he has also been removed by the South African Council of Educators from the roster, the list of registered teachers in the country. His name is Lubeko Magandela. So a fairly small incident in the grand scheme of things. I mean, it's obviously completely unacceptable. You can't punish a child by making a school child climb into a pit toilet. But this actually kind of speaks to the points we were just making about things like the quality of teachers in the country. I mean, a lot of I get it. Some teachers, they have to deal with kids who come from homes that aren't very healthy, and so sometimes the kids don't behave very well or have issues. But it's clear that at least some of our teachers, and I suspect a fair number, don't really know how to deal with some of these issues. Bheki, what do you make of this story? You were pretty horrified by it.
Yeah, I was pretty horrified by that. That principal should have never become a principal at all. In fact, I thought the fine of 4,000 Rand was way too low for him. I think he should actually face severe consequences for his action, like jail time and so forth. And the reason why particularly I was enraged with this, Nick, is that I see this all the time when I go to the Eastern Cape. I see this through my own experiences and talking to individuals in these schools and so forth. And unfortunately, a common trait in rural South Africa is pit toilets. And there's been reports, for example, over the years of children drowning in human feces. And for this principal to then ask this particular student to go down a pit toilet, I'm not sure if anyone has ever, or I'm sure some of you have seen a pit toilet for this, but for the ones that have not, it's absolutely dark in there. You have feces all the way until your face, if you've ever been down one, if the hole's deep enough and so forth. So it's absolutely disgusting and so forth. And if the student was infected with some form of infection, what would then happen, for example? Who would have to pay for those medical costs and so forth?
Yeah,
so
you
yeah,
don't want to go to
absolutely,
Eastern Cape Public Hospital.
You do not, exactly, which is like in some cases hours away from where these particular individuals stay and so forth. So I definitely don't think it should be something that should be taken lightly. I think there should be harsher consequences for this particular principal's actions.
Yeah, so I presume that since they have pled guilty, that they will be sentenced. Maybe there will be jail time. So, the story is probably not over for them from that perspective. But Terence, do you think this is emblematic of a larger problem, or are we perhaps blowing it up out of proportion?
God, I hope not. At least not in this, but not in respect to this particular gentleman's actions. Look, we certainly do have an issue in the country with a lot of people teaching because that is the career that was open to them, and but who by temperament are not suited to it. I know that there also have been repeated issues over the years of trying to do evaluation, but that's often very difficult because a lot of that because we don't really have a school inspectorate anymore. And what happens is that, you ask teachers to evaluate each other and it becomes a cartel. Everyone's equally excellent. But yeah, forget education. It's just like a human, just like a matter of humanity. There's a few things you don't do. You don't push an 11-year-old down a pit toilet. Very important one. It's like crossing those beams in the original Ghostbusters movie. You just don't do it. No, I mean, I personally hope this guy has the book and then a lot of other things thrown at him.
Yeah, I definitely agreed. All right, that is all the time we have for today. So we hope you found the show interesting. Please like the video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, leave us reviews on the podcast apps. Also, check out thedailyfriend.co.za for all sorts of opinion, news, analysis, all that kind of stuff. We hope to keep you informed about what's going on in the world and in South Africa. Anyway, we will see you tomorrow on the Daily Friend Show, and I hope you all have a most excellent and magnificent day. Cheers, everyone.